We have officially made it to the last episode in this first module. Learning is as easy as ABC, where we looked at all learning in just three basic parts, A, B, and C. So let's do a quick recap. B stands for behavior, and it's what a person does. Skill building is all about doing sets of things together. But remember that behavior never occurs without a context. So at least one thing happens before, and something always happens after a person does something. So now we examined part C, which stands for consequence, and we specifically examined the type of consequence responsible for teaching new skills. And that consequence is called reinforcement. Reinforcement always strengthens future behavior because something good happens, and therefore we're likely to repeat it. Repetition is really the key to learning. Then we examined different aspects of what occurs before behavior. So remember, A stands for antecedent. It's what precedes behavior. Motivation is a big factor in what we do. But as we learned last time, availability often partners up with motivation. And we can use those signals of availability as a tool to help build motivation for learning. But there's another aspect of part A that's also important for teaching, and it's a strategy called a prompt. This is availability's second partner. Prompts can be used by providing some additional assistance as a person is learning to respond to that signal of availability. So in other words, the prompt is really a layer of support between the opportunity to do something and the person doing it. So I do want to be clear what a prompt is not. A prompt is not doing something for your child. So if I were to if my child can't put on their own shoes, a prompt wouldn't be just having them sit down and I take their foot and I put their shoe on their feet for them. It would be helping my child in some way to put their own shoes on. I do also want to be clear that when we discuss the use of prompts, this is not the same thing as an unsupported practice called rapid prompting method. The name sometimes throws people off and they confuse one thing for another. And I did want to be clear that that's not what I'm referring to. All right, so prompts help ensure the correct response will occur, and then you can reinforce it. So by helping your child do something and then delivering something good right after they do it, they're going to be more likely to keep doing it. And this is important because to learn to do something new, you have to do it lots of times. And that repetition over time is what establishes that response. Prompts help to prevent some frustration and reduce the effort when you're learning a hard task. And this can really decrease a lot of challenging behavior. And as caregivers, we tend to provide more learning opportunities when we see our children being successful and less opportunities when there's a chance that they're going to present some challenging behavior. So they can help reduce a lot of our stress as well. All right, so there's some different types of prompts, but the type that you choose is going to depend upon the skill that you're teaching and the amount of prompting that your child requires to be able to do it. So there's a hierarchy here, and the ultimate goal is to reach independence. If your child can do something without any added assistance. Now, in general, you're probably going to get to that independent level faster if you select a less intrusive prompt from the beginning, because they're already starting out doing it more independently. However, this is not always the case. To reach the goal of independence, regardless of what prompt you use, at some point, you have to get rid of the prompt. And the sooner that you do that, the better. Now, some types of prompts are actually harder to get rid of. Another important thing with prompts is that they're only effective if the person can respond to the prompt. So the prompt itself has to be something your child can already do. And we'll go over prompt selection in a little bit, but first let's go over the different types of prompts. All right, we're going to start out with the most intrusive one here, which is your child doing something with the least amount of independence. It's providing physical guidance. So sometimes people refer to this as hand over hand, but it doesn't always look like literally hand over hand. It's really any physical movement that you're doing that causes your child to do a movement. For example, if I'm trying to teach my child some sign language and they can't yet copy a model, so I can't just show them and have them imitate me doing the sign, I might use a physical prompt. A full physical prompt, the person prompting is doing almost all of the motions or movement, and a partial physical prompt, so that's a little less, can be a lighter touch, or it can be the prompt not occurring across the entire movement, just the specific part that the individual struggles with. Oftentimes, that might be the beginning of the task, and sometimes once you initiate it, the person can continue to do it. All right, the next types of prompts are called verbal prompts, and these can be in the form of a reminder if that wouldn't be something typically part of that task, such as when I was teaching my son to put his dirty clothes in the basket, I would have to remind him a lot of times, put your clothes in the basket. But it can also look like giving them the answer or a hint. So it kind of dips into model a little bit here. For example, if my child loves juice and they can't say juice when they want it, and just showing them the juice wouldn't evoke that response. So in other words, a visual wouldn't be enough to get them to say juice. I might prompt juice. And if they can copy what I say, they can echo me. You can then use that to teach them to say new words in new ways. So I'm going to start out with a full prompt because I want to guarantee that they're going to get the response. But I may start getting rid of the prompt by providing either a partial verbal. So for example, maybe I whisper basket instead of saying put your dirty clothes in the basket. Or maybe I provide some phonetic cue. So maybe I get it started. I say ju instead of saying the whole word juice. But remember, it's only a prompt if it leads to your child responding correctly. So if I said j and they just said j, that wouldn't be an effective prompt. And I may need to repeat that several times before I can try to get rid of it. All right, the next is a model prompt. If your child is able to copy what other people do, so they're able to imitate, you can use that skill to teach other skills. This is really how we learn a lot of different skills, right? By watching other people, so the observational learning. So a model prompt could look like me showing my child something and having them copy what I am doing. But if I'm learning a new dance on TikTok, I'm going to copy the moves as I am watching. I'm not going to try to watch the whole video of the dance and then try to remember what I saw and then copy it when it's over. So just that point to make that it's best if they can imitate it while you're doing it. So if possible, having their own set of materials is going to allow you to demonstrate and your child copy without the delay. And then you also don't have to undo the step for them to do it. If I only have one sink, I have to turn off the water. I would turn on the water and then I would have to turn off the water to get them to imitate. You might be saying, well, there's two knobs, but I always teach turning on the cold water to prevent burns. So just a quick tip. All right, so a common gestural prompt is pointing, but it can really be any body movement, excuse me, that cues a response. It could be looking in the direction to cue someone to do something. A hand motion. These tend to be more subtle, so you might not be enough to evoke that response. A gestural prompt might be a good option if your child can perform the steps of a task, but needs a reminder of the next step in the sequence, or just to help them begin the next step. So here is a video demonstration of using gestural prompts.
Okay, wash your hands.
Now notice it was the gesture only, and it was not additional prompts. So she wasn't having me refer to a visual. She wasn't having me respond to verbal directions. It was just the gestural prompt. The more prompts that you give, the more that you're going to have to get rid of. And sometimes it can be difficult to know which one really guided that response. Which one do I get rid of and still have the person responding in the desirable way? All right, so next is positional. So when my son was having trouble remembering to put his dirty clothes in the basket, I simply just moved the basket right next to where he gets dressed, and it was the spot he was actually throwing his clothes anyway. And I can get rid of that prompt by slowly moving it back to its original location. And I often get asked, why don't you just keep it there permanently, right? Well, do you brush your teeth only when the toothbrush is prominently placed on the counter? As with any prompt, if you don't get rid of it, it could cause a problem down the road. So if everything has to be prominently visible for them to do it, then nothing is actually prominently visible, right? So you're not going to get to that independent level if they're still requiring a prompt, and doesn't matter what kind of prompt it is. All right, so I recorded a video in the last episode to demonstrate the use of a promise reinforcer to help my learner follow the direction to come here. And actually, as I was watching this video, I noticed that I had provided a prompt that I probably didn't need. It was very subtle, which is why I didn't even realize I was doing it. But I gestured, come here motion. And is it the end of the world I gave an extra prompt? No, but it might cause an issue down the road if my learner was relying on that prompt in order to respond. And especially if I'm not aware that I was prompting in some way, I'm not going to know to get rid of the prompt. And if your child relies on another person to provide some sort of prompt, then they're not going to be able to do it independently. They're going to continue to rely on the support of another person. So just avoid that common mistake of unknowingly prompting. And whenever you are prompting, you want to try to think about, how am I going to get rid of the prompt? As much as prompts are our friends, we also just want to get rid of them as fast as we can. All right, so next is a visual prompt, showing a picture, item, or written words to evoke a response. So for example, if I'm trying to teach a child to answer some questions, I might ask the question and then show the picture, the item, or a word if they can read. And then I'm going to ask them without showing the visual, is how I'm going to get rid of that prompt. So visuals are really common prompts that people attempt to use. But remember, it's only effective if it comes from something the person can already do. If I have to teach the person how to use the prompt, it's not the right prompt. Another thing with visuals is that they can tend to lead to more rigid responding instead of what we really want, which is flexible responding. So if your child tends to learn something and then they have a hard time doing it differently than the way they learned, you probably want to avoid a visual. If you're using this first visual here in this picture, my learner would know, would my learner know what to do when they get to steps 5 and 6 if there's a hand dryer instead of towels? So that's just one example of how that can create a problem sometimes with visuals. If I have to use different visuals for every possible hand washing setup that they might encounter, it's probably not the right prompt. All right, so finally, let's look at a time delay. This can really be used across all prompts, and it's about the timing of the prompt. If your child is just learning to do something, you might use a 0-second time delay, meaning I'm prompting immediately because this ensures that they're going to respond correctly and they don't really have a chance to make a mistake. It's also teaching them to respond quickly, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So you can use various increments of a time delay. 2 seconds is pretty common, meaning you provide 2 seconds for them to respond independently before you would prompt. But you really only want to do this and incorporate a time delay when you see your child is doing it pretty reliably. And one reason for that is additional time also increases the margin for error. So if they aren't really doing the skill pretty fluently, then it's more likely they're going to make an error, and especially if we're not prompting right away. It's also much harder to relearn something if you did it incorrectly as you learned it, rather than just learning to do it right the first time. So in other words, you want them to respond. You want that response to be quick and fluent. So quick and accurate. So I don't walk up to the sink and just stare at it for several seconds before I start washing my hands. No, I see the sink and I immediately start washing my hands. If someone asks me my name, I don't sit there and think about it for a minute. That's another response that I should be able to do pretty automatically. They didn't ask me to solve some complex equation. They simply asked me my name. And you might think that prompts inhibit the learning process and detract from independence, but when done correctly and systematically, prompts can speed up that learning process and increase opportunities for independence down the road. All right, so we've looked at the various types of prompts. Remember, the goal is to get rid of prompts as soon as we can. And one of the best ways to get rid of a prompt is to make sure that you're not using more than you need. All right, some common mistakes to avoid. Be really careful not to assume that your child can do something just because they can respond with a prompt or shortly after a prompt was given. This happens a lot when people try to teach something that a child really isn't ready to learn yet because they don't have the component skills involved. So for example, my son is in 1st grade and multiplication is not a skill that is introduced at this grade level. I could teach it to him through prompting. So I could teach him to respond, what's 6 times 6? And I could teach him to read the numeral 36. I could get him to respond. And if I did this enough, he learned that 6 times 6 is 36. But I didn't really teach him the process of multiplication. I only taught him to say 36 when I ask what's 6 times 6. Now, if I asked him what's 6 times 7, he's not going to be able to respond by thinking, okay, let me just add another group of 6, right? I didn't give him the tools to be able to kind of solve that problem. So I would have to teach every single multiplication problem individually versus if I just taught the process. And then, several weeks down the road, if I didn't ask it for a long, long time and I asked him what's 6 times 6, he's probably going to forget to say 36. It wasn't that he regressed. It was really that he truly never had the skill of multiplication to begin with. All right. So just keep that in mind. Just because that you can prompt something doesn't mean that the person is really learning to do it. If I was teaching hand washing, I could I would teach it in different places because they're going to be doing it in different places. And when we're in a public restroom, we were in a public restroom once, and the paper towel dispenser was empty. So my son, he tried to get he tried to dry his hands, and he got a used paper towel out of the trash, right? And I applaud him for this attempt to problem solve, but I had to prompt in that situation to shake his hands dry. And since I had to prompt that, I realized I'm going to need to teach this, and I'm going to have to set up a lot of opportunities where this would occur again. Because if I prompted, it doesn't mean that he's going to be able to do it in the future. All right. So here is a kind of Goldilocks guide to prompting. If you're familiar with the fairy tale Goldilocks, not too much, not too little. You just got to find that sweet spot, what's just right. So the golden rule here is select the prompt that's going to ensure the right response. Prompt dependency is learned. So you don't want to give too much prompting for too long, because then the person's only going to be able to do it when they're given prompts. So remember, a prompt is used to teach the person the skill, but if you have to prompt them to use the prompt, it's probably not the right prompt. To be effective, the prompt must be something that the learner can do. All right, sometimes children learn just to wait for adults to provide a prompt. So they might end up like putting out their hands for you just to, they're waiting for that prompt. And this could be a sign that they are becoming dependent upon that prompt. So the best way, again, to treat prompt dependency is just to prevent it from the beginning. Make sure that you're teaching the right skill at the right time, and that you are trying to get rid of the prompts as soon as possible. All right, so I'm going to have you practice beginning to use prompts for some activity of daily living. Remember that there's a number of different skills, which we'll talk about in the next module of this series. So you're going to use different prompts for different skills. So I'm going to have you pick something that you're going to be kind of teaching using one of the prompts that we go over. Hand washing is a good one, okay? If they cannot do all the steps on their own, you want to consider using prompts to teach it. So it's helpful to observe what they are doing and kind of note the steps that they can already do and the ones that they can't. Because you don't really want to be prompting things that they can already do. That's where you want to let that time, incorporate that time for them to do it on their own. But when you get to something they can't do, you want to give that prompt right away and then try to get rid of that prompt as soon as you can. So again, if you're teaching hand washing, it's best to avoid verbal prompts. They're actually really difficult to get rid of. So prompting from behind for any step the learner can't do is one of the best ways to prompt for this specific task. So for my son, he could get the soap, but then he would immediately rinse the soap off. He wouldn't rub his hands. So every time I let him do all those steps independently, but when we would get to that step, so when I would have him do the steps independently, I kind of be there as a spotter, ready to prompt if he needed, but he did it independently until he got to that step where he rub his hands. And then I used physical guidance to get it started. And I gradually released once I could feel him doing it more on his own. And when he completed the rest of the task independently, I would reinforce the completion of the task. So it's really best if you can wait for the most independent responding or the task to finish, and then reinforce that task. So for example, I said, nice washing your hands. Let's go get a snack. So something pretty natural there. All right. So again, I said breaking down the task and identifying the steps that they can do already and the ones that you're going to need to teach. Here's a great tool for breaking down multiple step tasks into smaller subtasks. This is called a task analysis. It helps you to identify which steps you need to prompt. You can create a task analysis for any task by just writing down each of the steps. You can do it and then write down the steps. But here is a really great, and I want to emphasize, free tool that does it for you. So it's a website. They have an app, but I just got on the website, and it's goblin.tools. There's a link to this in the resource collection posted at the end here, goblin.tools. All right, you can type in any task, and then you can use those chili peppers in the far right corner, depending upon how much you want to break that task down. And then it instantly populates all the steps for you. But then you have the option to customize those steps. So you can click and drag to rearrange those if you do them in a different order. You can also remove irrelevant subtasks, as well as edit and add subtasks. You can then use the magic wand icon to further break down each step. And I did this for the rub hand step because this is the one I really had to work on teaching. So when I used that magic wand button, it broke down smaller subtasks of that rubbing hand step. And then I can continue to use that magic wand icon if I want to break down any of those subtasks. I can do that as many times as I want. All right, so as we wrap up here, I want to give a special thanks to Amy Miller and the Waynesboro Area School District for helping with the video that was featured in this episode. And that concludes Module 1. Learning is as easy as ABC. Join me for the next module in this series called Talking About Talking. In the meantime, be sure to check out the resource collections pinned in the comments section, and also subscribe and turn on notifications so that you won't miss an episode. Thanks again for joining me.